Meanwhile, Rubio explicitly said anti-colonial uprisings were bad, praised 5 centuries of empire building, and argued that we need to stop being shackled by guilt and shame about Western history. When AOC said that she went to Munich to sound the alarm about inequality fueling far-right movements, she's describing exactly what Rubio's speech represents. He's not offering solutions to global problems. He's offering white Western identity politics as foreign policy.
So Philip DeFranco, for a very long time, has been one of my least favorite figures on the internet.com. And by the way, this actually dates back prior to his leftward shift, because even before that, he was doing this thing where he would talk about an issue and then he'd have no opinion at all whatsoever, but he'd leave it up to you guys out there in the audience, because according to him, the Philip DeFranco show is a conversation, not a show, when that's obviously absurd. In fact, this is one of the reasons why every time we mention Philip DeFranco, I remind you that this is in fact a show, not a conversation. In reality, I make words come out of my face and you guys listen. Sometimes you leave comments and feedback, but the idea that I have to provoke a parasocial relationship in order to take advantage of you, in order to make myself more successful, was always something that I was not in favor of, and I find to be incredibly disingenuous. But of course, after a while, because Philip DeFranco has been surrounded by so many left-wing people, he started to just come out and fully unmask himself as a left-wing activist, and his show has gotten increasingly more dishonest, where he doesn't even give you the other side of the argument during his presentation, and he consistently will lie and misrepresent facts in order to make the case that the Democrats are right about everything and the Republicans are evil and bad, Trump bad, Orange Man bad, roll the Anna clip.
Trump simply hearing Trump bad over again.
And again, while it's fine to disagree with the evil bad Orange Man, I have my disagreements with him myself, this smug attitude that also accompanies this, that somehow he has gotten more evolved since he stopped lying to his audience and pretending he was a moderate, is absurd and ridiculous. Also, in addition to that, Philip DeFranco's wife is currently running for school board in Fulton County, Georgia, and I think it is very important for you guys in that area to vote against her, because she is also a rabid left-wing activist who, no joke, lists as one of her qualifications for office being the vice president of the company that Philip DeFranco started, which, by the way, is probably due to the fact that she's married to Philip DeFranco. I mean, who are we kidding here? Are we serious right now? This is absurd. But what we're going to talk about today is Philip DeFranco's analysis, if you can call it that, of AOC's foreign trip, because he is jumping into the camp of her presidential campaign, and his weird, asinine, and absurd criticism of Marco Rubio that he would not make if a Democrat gave a similar speech praising Europeans. So this is what we're going to talk about today, but before we do, I want to thank everybody who helps this show, which is now a conversation when you give me money, over on actualjusticewarrior.com/join.
Give me the money. Give me the money. Okay.
Then also with this, you saw Republicans seizing on a few specific moments where she seemed to stumble, and they try to use that as evidence that she and the Democrats more broadly are unserious about foreign policy. So for example, when she was asked about whether the U.S. should commit troops to defending Taiwan if China moves against it, she appeared to kind of fumble for a good 20 seconds before giving a non-answer.
I think that this is such a, I think that this is a, this is, of course, a very longstanding policy of the United States. And I think what we are hoping for is that we want to make sure that we never get to that point. And we want to make sure that we are moving in all of our economic research and our global positions to avoid any such confrontation and for that question to even arise.
So one of the things that you should notice about dishonest media coverage is the language, the descriptor words, and how weak and vague they get anytime it's somebody that they absolutely love or support versus the people that they don't like. And a perfect example of this is Philip DeFranco talking about Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez appearing to stumble for 20 seconds during a question where she was asked about the nation of Taiwan and whether or not the United States of America should intervene militarily in order to stop China from taking Taiwan. Now, the thing is, she didn't appear to stumble for 20 seconds. If you time it, it's actually 21 seconds. It's an objective fact, yet Philip DeFranco tries to vague that up in order to defend her and try to make it seem like everybody's talking about minor flubs related to Ocasio-Cortez, and his other example has to do with Maduro and, of course, Ocasio-Cortez saying that, oh, Venezuela is south of the equator.
Also with this, you tweeted people pointing to another point where instead of saying transatlantic partnership, she said
Trans-Pacific Partnership.
The AOC later acknowledging that that was just a mistake. And then lastly, during a question about Venezuelan ex-president Nicolas Maduro, she said,
he canceled elections. He was an anti-democratic leader. That doesn't mean that we can kidnap a head of state and engage in acts of war just because the nation is below the equator.
Right, and for context, Venezuela is just above the equator.
Now look, while that flub on its own is funny and it doesn't really matter, and by the way, it's additionally funny because Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is half Venezuelan, so she doesn't even know where her ancestral homeland is. The fact is, this actually was not a flub. It's actually a statement of ideological principles that Philip DeFranco is not telling you about out there in the audience. And we talked about it in our previous video on this topic, but essentially what AOC is trying to promote is this idea that the global north is oppressing the global south. So ideologically, she is aligning Venezuela with that global south position, which is south of the equator, which of course seeks to blame the United States of America, Europe, and Asia for the struggles in those economies.
When we talk about a class-based internationalist perspective also means ending the hypocrisy towards the global south. And that is a challenge that is difficult for much of the typical crowd at Munich to hear. You know, we look at what happened in Venezuela, for example. It is not a It is not a remark on who Maduro was as a leader. He canceled elections. He was an anti-democratic leader. That doesn't mean that we can kidnap a head of state and engage in acts of war just because the nation is below the equator. And
and specifically in Latin America and sub-Saharan Africa. Again, Australia is entirely south of the equator, but somehow it's a successful modern Western country. It's almost as if your position on the map doesn't dictate whether or not you're actually oppressed, and in reality, it has to do, at least in part, with the character of the people, and Australians happen to be the descendants of British people, so they have British common law, which has proven to be successful everywhere that it's been tried, and thus that leads to their success compared to other peoples in the global south. In addition to that, I will also point out that geography, not oppression, plays a much more significant role in these nations, as they tend to have disadvantageous geography due to the fact that a lot of these continents are much longer north to south than they are east to west, which, by the way, means that certain things that grow and work in the climates that are usually similar east to west don't work north and south. So no, it's not oppression, evil white racism, or whatever excuse that Ocasio-Cortez brings up earlier on. And of course, Philip DeFranco is ignoring this completely because he buys into the same leftist dogma with his promotion of figures like Cenk's nephew as Ocasio-Cortez does.
But also, she did participate in the viral clip drama at least a little bit because she took this shot at Trump's Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, for this claim.
Our horses, our ranches, our rodeos, the entire romance of the cowboy archetype that became synonymous with the American West. These were born in Spain.
And with that, you had AOC later calling that out in the same conference.
my favorite part was when he said that American cowboys came from Spain.
I thought they came from Winnetou, but
I believe the Mexicans and descendants of African enslaved peoples would like to have a word on that.
Now that then, of course, it sparked this heated debate online about where cowboys actually come from.
Now, DeFranco also, in his quest to defend Ocasio-Cortez, ends up playing this clip, or these clips back to back, of Marco Rubio talking about how cowboy culture actually comes from Spain. It's something that was inherited from them, and Ocasio-Cortez gets really angry, and she talks about how, I think the Mexicans and the enslaved black people have a lot to say about that. Maybe you should call them Marco Rubio, as if Ocasio-Cortez's account runs contrary to anything Marco Rubio said. Again, as we talked about in our last video on AOC specifically, horses were brought over to the New World from Spain. Mexico exists because it's a Spanish colony, and enslaved black people were also brought into Latin America by Spain and by Portugal, obviously, obviously in Brazil, as a part of the transatlantic slave trade. Also, cows and rodeos and all these other different things were inherited from Spain, and that is ultimately what made up cowboy culture in the United States of America, regardless of whether or not Mexicans, which again are partially Spaniards at least, or the descendants of enslaved black people in Mexico, again also brought here by the Spaniards, were participants and were cowboys. But look, the ethnic makeup of cowboys is not actually what is at issue here. In fact, whether or not cowboy culture is descendant or built upon things brought over from Spain is not actually what Philip DeFranco and Ocasio-Cortez are mad about. What they're angry about is that Marco Rubio was talking about European culture and talking about something that they consider way too close to white identity or white people doing something or changing history for the better, and that is what is making DeFranco so mad, and he essentially goes on this crazed anti-white rant about it, which again makes no sense at all, is stupid in every possible way, and I think is important for us to break down.
Because on the one hand, he took a much friendlier, more cooperative posture toward Europe than Trump and Vance have, which gave many there some reassurance. But on the other hand, the common ground that he found between America and Europe, it was a little abstract, and to many, it sounded like a dog whistle for race.
We are part of one civilization, Western civilization. We are bound to one another by the deepest bonds that nations could share, forged by centuries of shared history, Christian faith, culture, heritage, language, ancestry, and the sacrifices our forefathers made together. We are connected spiritually, and we are connected culturally.
Now, we should note here that scholars debate whether the concept Western civilization is even useful or historically tenable.
So again, this is stupid in every possible way for a number of reasons. First and foremost, people refer to Europe and America and Australia as the West across the world. Typically, this is done by Russia, this is done by China, this is done by potential other powers in the world or historic powers, because this is obviously a designation that they have labeled us with because they saw us as grouped together as one thing. And again, we had been bound at least since World War II by the NATO alliance with all these different historically Western powers or Western civilization based powers. So this is not controversial at all whatsoever. It shouldn't be considered that. But of course, this is too adjacent to white people and it bothers Philip DeFranco. And he's going to make that absolutely clear with this little next statement.
But even putting that aside, many of the things that Rubio thinks bind the West together, language, culture, religion, ancestry, they are precisely things that tore Europe apart in bloody wars for centuries.
So look, while what DeFranco is saying right here is technically true, Europeans are actually quite diverse and distinct from one another, as we talked about in a previous video. It's actually being deployed completely disingenuously by Philip DeFranco, because as he knows, and as many of you know, when you bring all these different people that are white, that come from Europe, from distinct cultural backgrounds that are in no way, shape, or form similar to the others, they all get flattened out into white people when convenient, when you want to label them oppressors. But now, when it's more convenient to talk about the divisions of Europe, all of a sudden you recognize all those distinctions that you refuse to recognize in the United States of America when you're labeling people evil white racists. So that's absolutely embarrassing. But what's even more embarrassing is this next take from DeFranco, which just goes to show you can never actually praise anything that's good about white people, even if you're doing so based on individual nation of origin, while in the context of being at a conference in Europe.
Rubio cast all of Europe as one unified civilization that single-handedly made the United States what it is. Or with him lumping together Christopher Columbus, English settlers, Scots-Irish frontiersmen, German farmers and craftsmen, French fur traders and explorers, and of course, Spanish cowboys. Meanwhile, you had many noting he made no mention of any contribution by non-European peoples, no mention of the slaves who picked the cotton, no mention of the Chinese who built the railroads, nothing about the Mexicans who labored on farms, and that's just kind of naming a few of the many, many examples.
So again, this is just proof positive that no matter what you do as a Republican, you are going to be attacked by the clowns like Philip DeFranco and Ocasio-Cortez. And again, there's also no context where it's acceptable to praise white people for anything that they've done throughout the course of history, because what Philip DeFranco just suggested right there, that Marco Rubio should have dedicated time to praising African slaves, Chinese laborers, and Mexicans, which by the way, way, again, Spanish colony. They get their language and much of their culture from Spain, so from Europe, which is something that Rubio brought up before that DeFranco got angry about, because, oh my god, the Mexican cowboys, they're completely different. Why do they speak Spanish? Who the hell knows? It couldn't be that they come from Spain, or at least descend partially from Spain. That's absurd. But again, they're in the context of a European conference where Marco Rubio is trying to praise and warm relations with European nations by talking about the shared history that they have and their relationship to the United States of America. If Marco Rubio was visiting, let's say, China or somewhere for an Asian conference, and he talked exclusively about contributions from Japanese people or Chinese rail workers or from Koreans in the United States of America and how we're shared in our history and whatnot, and they added so much to this nation, nobody would bat an eye. They say, that's good. That's a good internationalist perspective. And nobody would be mentioning that he didn't talk about the enslaved people that were doing farm work in the United States of America. They would not mention that he didn't talk about Mexicans or anything of the sort. If Rubio were in Latin America and he started praising a bunch of Latin American contributions to America, we would all understand exactly why he's doing that, because he's trying to win over the host population. So he's in Europe praising Europeans, not as generalized white people, but as individual groups that migrated at different periods of time to the United States of America. And that's still a problem for Philip DeFranco, because again, he has adopted fully this pussified white guilt ideology that says you can never and absolutely ever praise white people for anything. And by the way, this is also incredibly hypocritical, because if Biden went over to Europe and praised Europeans for their history and their contributions to the United States of America, they would never criticize him for this at all whatsoever. In fact, they would say, look, the Democrats are trying to warm relations after Trump's hostility in his first term. What a great thing. This is what we need to do. We are in a community of nations in the world, and he's winning over our European allies. But Marco Rubio does the exact same thing, and they're like, well, is this evil white racism? Is there some anti-minority stuff afoot? He's saying good things about white peoples that were in Europe and their contributions throughout history of the United States of America. So does this somehow, through the transitive property, mean that he hates black people? Again, it's absurd. It's asinine.
This is why we do not want our allies to be shackled by guilt and shame. We want allies who are proud of their culture and of their heritage, who understand that we are heirs to the same great and noble civilization.
Meanwhile, Rubio explicitly said anti-colonial uprisings were bad, praised 5 centuries of empire building, and argued that we need to stop being shackled by guilt and shame about Western history. When AOC said that she went to Munich to sound the alarm about inequality fueling far-right movements, she's describing exactly what Rubio's speech represents. He's not offering solutions to global problems. He's offering white Western identity politics as foreign policy.
But remember, when people like Philip DeFranco, Ocasio-Cortez, or the majority of people on the left talk about white supremacy or white privilege or any of these terms that start with the word white, their issue isn't with the supremacy part or the privilege part or anything after the word white. It's with white itself. And if you don't believe me, just ask these people to name a country that is white majority that they don't consider to be a white supremacist nation. They won't be able to do it. And the reason they won't be able to do it is because their issue is with white people existing, being acknowledged, even individually acknowledged as nations, even talking about the shared commonality, Western civilization, as we are labeled, by the way, by hostile foreign powers like China and Russia, the former Soviet Union as well. That's not good enough. That's not square enough. You just need to shut up and never do anything but praise enslaved black people, because you owe them absolutely everything, because they picked cotton. And by the way, they were the real cowboys. We was cowboys. Forget about the fact that the Spaniards brought over cows, the words for cowboys, the rodeo culture, the horses, and by the way, the Mexicans were part Spaniard. Just forget about all that. It was all about the natives, the indigenous that just came up with this stuff uniquely on their own, and black people that were also brought by Spaniards. But we're also going to forget about that unless we want to yell at the Spaniards for being a bunch of evil white racists. It's crazy, it's absurd, and it just goes to show you how far DeFranco has gone, because he doesn't even realize how stupid he sounds at this moment in time. And again, he doesn't doesn't care because even in the context of going to Europe, trying to win over European allies, praising Europeans is too close to praising white people. Therefore, it's absolutely terrible and disgusting. And by the way, Marco Rubio has been dinged for talking about how he's of Spanish origin because, again, the precursor culture to Cuban origin, which is where his family is from prior to the United States of America, is Spaniard culture. And the reason he's doing this, again, is because he's in Europe and he's trying to win over folks in Spain. If he was in Latin America, he would be emphasizing his Cuban culture. Like, we should all be able to understand this. Hell, if he was in Miami, he would be emphasizing his Cuban culture. But guess what? The too white adjacent, too much talk in relation to white people not being bad and not being the villain, that's the major problem. But you know what? Those are just my thoughts. I want to know what you guys think down in the comments below. As per usual, if you like this video, show them by leaving a like, subscribe for more content, follow me on my social medias, support me via the support links in the description of this video. This has been me talking about Philip DeFranco having a little bit of a meltdown, trying to defend AOC and attacking white people. Till next time.